Modern Druidism. Druidry, sometimes termed Druidism, is a modern spiritual or religious movement that generally promotes harmony, connection, and reverence for the natural world. This is commonly extended to include respect for all beings, including the environment itself. Many forms of modern Druidry are modern pagan religions, although most of the earliest modern Druids identified as Christians. Originating in Britain during the 18th century, Druidry was originally a cultural movement, and only gained religious or spiritual connotations later in the 19th century. The core principle of Druidry is respect and veneration of nature, and as such it often involves participation in the environmental movement. Another prominent belief among modern Druids is the veneration of ancestors, particularly those who belonged to prehistoric societies. Arising from the 18th century Romanticist movement in Britain, which glorified the ancient Celtic peoples of the Iron Age, the early Neo-Druids aimed to imitate the Iron Age priests who were also known as Druids. At the time, little accurate information was known about these ancient priests, and the modern Druidic movement has no direct connection to them, despite contrary claims made by some modern Druids. In the late 18th century, modern Druids developed fraternal organizations modeled on Freemasonry that employed the romantic figure of the British Druids and Bards as symbols of the indigenous spirituality of prehistoric Britain. Some of these groups were purely fraternal and cultural, such as the oldest one that remains, the Ancient Order of Druids founded in 1781, creating traditions from the national imagination of Britain. Others, in the early 20th century, merged with contemporary movements such as the physical culture movement and naturism. Since the 1980s, some modern Druid groups have adopted similar methodologies to those of Celtic Reconstructionist paganism in an effort to create a more historically accurate practice. However, there is still controversy over how much resemblance modern Druidism may or may not have to the Iron Age Druids. Modern Druidry derives its name from the magico-religious specialists of Iron Age Western Europe who were known as Druids. There is no real historical continuity between the Druids of Iron Age Europe and modern Druids. However, some Druids nevertheless regard modern Druidry as a genuine continuation of the practices of the Iron Age Druids. Some 18th century sources like Ilo Morganwg fabricated what he claimed were early Welsh literary sources and traditions that supposedly dated to the prehistoric Druids. Gorst, one of the 18th century traditions that were founded by Morganwg, became part of the 12th century Eisteddfod festival. The concerns of modern Druidry, which include healing the planet and seeking connections with the natural world, are likely very different from those of the Iron Age societies in which the original Druids lived. Other 18th century fabrications like the fragments of ancient poetry published by James Macpherson between 1760 and 1763. The poems were hugely popular. They were read by many of the notable figures of the period, including Voltaire, Napoleon and Thomas Jefferson, and quality of the poetry inspired contemporary comparisons with Homer. Though attributed to the ancient semi-legendary poet Ossian, the works are believed to have been composed by a wistful Macpherson seeking to recreate the oral traditions of Scotland. Everything presently known about the Iron Age Druids derives from archaeological evidence and Greco-Roman textual sources, rather than material produced by these Druids themselves. Due to the scarcity of knowledge about the Iron Age Druids, their belief system cannot be accurately reconstructed. Some Druids incorporate everything that is known about Iron Age Druids into their practices. However, as noted by Irish contemporary paganism scholar, Jenny Butler, the historical realities of Iron Age religion are often overlooked by Druids in favor of a highly romanticized version. Many Druids believe that the practices of the Iron Age Druids should be revived and modified to meet current needs. In Ireland, some Druids have claimed that because the island was never conquered by the Roman Empire, the Iron Age Druids survived here and their teachings were passed down hereditarily until modern times, at which modern Druids can reclaim them. Some Druids claim that they can channel information about the Iron Age Druids. Druidry has been described as a religion, a new religious movement, a spiritual movement, and a nature religion. It has been described as a form of contemporary paganism, and on the contemporary pagan spectrum between Reconstructionism and eclecticism, Druidry sits on the latter end. Various Druidic groups also display New Age and neo-shamanic influences. The Druidic community has been characterized as a neo-tribe, for it is disembedded and its membership iselective. Druidry has been described as a form of Celtic spirituality, or Celtic-based spirituality. Scholar of religion Marion Bowman described Druidry as the Celtic spirituality par excellence. Some practitioners regard Druidry as a form of native spirituality, and it displays an affinity with folk religions. In defining Druidry as a native spirituality, some Druids seek to draw elements from other native religions, such as the belief systems of Australian Aboriginal and Native American communities. Practitioners differ in the levels of formality and seriousness that they bring to their adherents. Some groups use the word Druid for both male and female practitioners, eschewing the term Druidess for female followers. Following terms devised by the Druid Philip Cargom, a distinction has been drawn between cultural Druids, who adopt the term as part of their Welsh and Cornish cultural activities, and esoteric Druids who pursue the movement as a religion. The scholar of religion Marion Bowman suggested believing as an alternative term to esoteric. There are also individuals who cross these two categories, involving themselves in cultural Druidic events while also holding to modern pagan beliefs. Some cultural Druids nevertheless go to efforts to disassociate themselves from their esoteric and pagan counterpart. The Cornish Ghost, for example, has publicly disassociated any links to paganism. Some Druids identify as pagan, others as Christian. Some practitioners merge pagan and Christian elements in their own personal practice, in at least one case identifying as a Christa-Druid. Other practitioners adopt additional elements. For instance, there are self-described Zen Druids and Hasidic Druids. The earliest modern Druids aligned themselves with Christianity. Some writers like William Stukeley regarded the Iron Age Druids as proto-Christians who were monotheists worshipping the Christian God. In a similar vein, some modern Druids believe that ancient Druidic wisdom was preserved through a distinct Celtic Christianity. Over the course of the 20th century, and particularly since the early 1960s, Druidry increasingly came to be associated with the modern pagan movement. Nature-centered spirituality. Druidry has been described as a nature-venerating movement. Druidry conceives of the natural world as being imbued with spirit, and thus regard it as alive and dynamic. Because they view the natural world as sacred, many Druids are involved in environmentalism, thereby acting to protect areas of the natural landscape that are under threat from development or pollution. Druids are generally critical of mainstream society, regarding it as being governed by consumerism, environmental exploitation, and the supremacy of technology. In contrast to this, Druids seek to establish a way of living that they regard as being more natural. Through seeking a connection with nature, Druids pursue a sense of cosmic belonging.